So, good morning, everyone. And as part of today's lecture, we'll be starting with SQL. And SQL is to give a brief introduction about SQL. SQL is basically like a database-oriented programming language, and it is completely different than the other programming languages which we have seen until now, like Python programming language. It's completely different than that, and why it is being used basically. So basically, it's used for doing almost similar kind of task related to Python or like any other programming languages, but with some limited functionalities. Now, those limited functionalities are basically evolving to some additional advanced capabilities which other programs provide. Now, in general, like why the main core behind SQL is like SQL is being widely used for doing database oriented programming. Now, what is a database exactly? So, in a real life example, if we see we have a website which has been up and running, and whatever data is been stored inside that website, that data is actually being stored in the backend in a database table. Now, the database tables are nothing but like a SQL tables, which we call upon. Now, during the course of this lecture, we'll be seeing what those database tables are and how they are viewed and how to write SQL queries on those tables so that we can retrieve any kind of data which we want as well as modify any kind of data which we see in that table. So this is just like a brief overview about SQL. Now, to just give a standard introduction about SQL, SQL is short form is SQL, and its full form is structured structured query language. So this is the full form of SQL. Now, in order to get more detail, like the year it was developed or like being like launched into the market was in year 1986. SQL has been launched, and since the release year, like from 1986, is been widely used across majority of the web applications as well as desktop applications used in almost all of the companies right now. So what is it exactly used for this SQL? So use of the SQL is basically it allows to access as well as manipulate databases. Now, as I said, like accessing and manipulating databases. So database is nothing but like an entity or like a data storage object provided in like any standard tool like Microsoft or Oracle or any other companies, large companies, they have their own set of databases. The widely popularly used is something called as Microsoft SQL Server, and it provides us internal databases. And why SQL is used is it is basically used to work on those databases which have been provided by these companies like Microsoft or Oracle. So coming down to the same logic, like what is basically a database? So database is nothing but like a data storage object provided by vendor companies like Microsoft. Okay, so I do have a tool here which I can open up and show you like how the databases looks like, but it has some connectivity issue. But I'll just on a high level, I can show you like what is that tool. So the tool over here is this one, which is like Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. So inside this studio, what we can do is we can connect to the database first. So it needs access to a particular server. And once we connect it, then that server login has been given access to us. And once that server login access has been given, what we can do is we can create databases as well as tables, or and then perform some kind of operations like addition of data into that table or modification of data into that table. Now, right now, I cannot connect because it's having some issue with the SQL server, but I do have another copy which basically explains all the things which I talked about. But this is just one of the standard example of a SQL server. So just to give a high level, right? Like now, as I said about database, now database is like the topmost parent hierarchy. And what does it contains basically? Now we know like it contains data, but what kind of data has been stored and how that data is being stored. So basically in any database, the data is going to be stored in tables, which is like data is always stored in tables. Now again, new question arises like what's exactly a table? So what is a table exactly? So table is, if you visualize, it's something like the functionality we have already known for a long time, where if we insert, so the table structure which we see right now, let's say we want to store 2 cross 2 table like this, but I don't want like these bullet points. I remove it. So this is something called as a table. Now, similar to this architecture, these databases have tables like this. Now, let's say I want to have a table called as example, like I want to have a table which contains names in it. So how can I do that? So let's say I give the name of the table as name table. So this table's name is called as name table. Now, as the name suggests, I want to just store names in it. So I can have any name like X, Y, Z. Then, so my first name is X, Y, Z. Then on the next line, if I want to store one more name, I can create one more row into this table and say the name as like PQR. But we cannot just blindly store any data into these tables. So if you see this first column, we are storing the names. Now in SQL and its database and its corresponding table, every column should have a column name. That's like a mandatory thing. So since this column contains names, what we can say the column name as name. And then we can have some more additional information for these names, like I want to store like age of these every names. So first person's age is let's say 10 years, and then the second person's age is 15 years. So looking at this, what we see is table, the way you see is similarly represented in databases. And database can contain not only one table, but infinite number of tables. That means infinite doesn't means like it can store like almost infinite, but until like a certain limit, and that limit can be in thousands tables also. So any other random standard application doesn't needs like 1,000 tables. It limits only until like 100 to 200 tables. So that's like more sufficient enough for any kind of standard system.
Tejasvi Print Kanachika.
So this is how the table looks. And as per our understanding, what we got to know is like every table, its column should have a column name. That's like a mandatory thing. And then it may or may not have data inside it. So we can have an empty table like this with just column names. And inside this table, we can have data. And if there is no data, then also it's fine. So if there is no data inside this table, we call it as like empty table. But ideally, whenever a table is created, we put some data inside it. So if you come back, this is like a standard table example, which looks like. So similar to this, we can create one more table like address table. So we can have one more table called as a table which holds all the addresses. So we can call it as like address table. Now my address table will be again having like two columns, let's say like a name of the person and its address. So we can do is copy this table, paste it, and instead of age, I can have his address for this person. Now address can be anything. Let's say Mumbai, then it's Delhi, and same way. So if you look at these tables, sorry. So if we look at these two tables, we can create like n number of tables, as I said, in the database. Now, how do we create these tables and how do we work on these tables is like a next step, which we'll be doing in our further sessions. But just to give an understanding, again going back to the SQL. So SQL is basically a structured query language which has been utilized to run on these tables as well as databases. So now database is nothing but a collection of tables like this. So so any database will have 0 to n number of tables present in it. And then in every table, we can have n number of columns as well as n number of rows present in it. So it doesn't means like our tables column would be always two. It can go until like 100 or more than 100 columns also. And then in terms of rows, it can go in like millions of rows also. And these kind of similar tables, which contains millions of rows, we can have n number of tables like this. So looking at this, you can assume your database size will go in like gigabytes for any standard application. So that's a brief overview about SQL database and table, because these are the three components or like the two most components for every SQL to be used. One is like database and then its internal tables. And just to add up there, once we have these tables created, or let's say we want to create a table like this, we can use SQL to create a table like this. As well as if you want to insert the data of a new person into this, then we can use SQL. So those are something like capabilities of SQL. So if you go into details now, like what are the capabilities of SQL? So basically what we're trying to understand is what are the things which SQL can help us do. And based on the capabilities list, you'll see like it is able to do almost each and every aspect of a standard database requirement is given. So just to easyfy that, like just to make it more easier, you can do anything with respect to your tables as well as databases. That's what the assumption is for SQL. Now that anything can be so you can create a table. So before even creating a table, right, you can create a database, which is like the parent entity. And once a database is created, you can create a table inside it. And once a table is created, you can insert data into table. And once you have inserted the data, you can update the data from table. And so this includes like inserting, updating. Now, other than insert and update, what you can do is you can delete the data from table. So looking at this list, what we are seeing is it's been able to do almost all the tasks which are relating to tables. So inserting, updating, deleting, and then lastly, you can retrieve the data from the table also. So you can retrieve data from table also. So that means we can create a table like this first, but before even creating the table, we need a database creation. So if you go by the sequence, these are the steps needed. Like once we need to first have a database, and inside that database, we need to have a table. And once we have a table, then we can insert the data into table, then update the data. Let's say I've inserted XYZ and age 10. Now I need to update the age to 20. I can do that using SQL. Then later on, I want to delete this row from the table. I can delete it. And not only just single row, I can delete as many number of rows which I want based on a given condition. And then lastly, I can retrieve also. So retrieving means like I want to display the data of a certain table in a certain format. I can do that. Now it can be all the rows within the table or only a certain set of rows within the table. I can do that also. So these are some of the major things which we can do relating to the table. But if you go to the database, we can do a few more things which are related to the database. So if we can create a database, then we cannot modify it, but we can drop a database. For database, it's either you create it or delete it. You cannot update it or like you cannot retrieve it. There are only two operations related to database. It's like creating as well as deleting. But for a table, there are like almost all the operations which we can perform. So looking at this, database is like more of like a foundation which is acting like a base. And within that foundation, we can have as many tables as we want, and then we can perform all these operations we want. These are like some of the like data manipulation capabilities which are provided by SQL. But there are like few more additional capabilities which are provided by SQL, something called as like permissions. Now there are like three type of permissions. One is called as read, then another is called as write, and the last one is called as alter. Alter is nothing but like a synonym for update. So what are these permissions? So permissions comes after you create a table. So now you have a table created, and let's say there are like almost 1,000 people who are looking at this table, or like they have access to this 1,000 tables. But you need to restrict this table's data, or out of those 1,000 people, we just want like only 10 people to get access to this table. And how do we do that is by doing this permissions for this table. Now this permissions doesn't need like more of SQL, but it's more of like a configuration provided by the respective tool within SQL. For example, now using this SQL tool which I have, I can go into my settings, and inside the database settings, I can configure who can look into a certain table and who cannot look into a table, as well as uh, similar to the read, I can give functions like write. Like let's say I want to say few people can insert the data into the table and few people can update the data into a table also. So basically it's nothing but all these operations we can segregate in terms of users. Like we can assign these operations right to certain users and we can remove these rights from certain users. So that's like a permissions which have been provided by SQL. So overall, these are the core capabilities of SQL. Now, just to go back again, like until now, what we understood is two things about SQL: database, tables, and then capabilities which are provided by SQL. Now, the next thing is in the brief introduction we talked about is use of SQL. Like where is it used exactly? Like we know now, like what is this SQL used for, and what are its capabilities, but where is it used exactly? So SQL has been used in almost in like all of the web applications which you serve. Like any web application, you just open it over the internet and there would be a database created for that web application, and that database is nothing but the database which we are talking about, and inside that database we will have like tables. So this is the similar hierarchy or like the standard structure for every website which you see. And it's not only just website, it is similar for any mobile application which you use. So the use of SQL, or like where is it used, is it's used in like web application development, then mobile application development, then we can have any kind of like desktop application. Now desktop application and web application, there is a difference, and the difference is this Microsoft Word which we are using over the computer, this is not running on the web browser like a Google Chrome or Internet Explorer, and that's why we call it as a desktop application. Now similarly for this Word application, there is a SQL database being used, but we don't have access to it. That's why we cannot see on like a usual basis like the database of SQL. But whatever files we store in our computer are being stored into files operating system, like operating system of your computer. And that operating system is doing but nothing but storing these files into a database. That's like more core related topic, but just the difference between desktop and web is like anything not running on your web browser but running on your computer is a desktop application. So these are like some of the key components. Now it's not just limited to these three things. There are like few more things, like let's say game development. Like if you want to develop a game, any game which we see, there also SQL is being used. So almost any kind of software application whichever needs like data, and that data can be either like using that data or working on that data, we will need a database for it. So this is just like a one of the short list which we know which SQL helps in implementing. Okay, so this covers like a brief introduction about SQL. Now the next thing what we can move is going into detail of each and every aspect of SQL's topic. Like let's say I want a database, then how do I do create that database and then work on that database. So I see like the sessions time is just like 8 minutes remaining. What I'll do is I'll just share you one link, and once the session is over, we all can join on that second link, or I'll let you know like once the session is up to like closing time, then you can jump into that link. Let me create one link. So I'm just sharing one link just in case if the session goes off, we all can join on this link. Okay, so moving to the next topic, like getting into the core topics of SQL, we'll go into the queries which are being provided by SQL. Like how do we perform all the operations which we talked about using SQL now. So what we can call the like database related, or not database, but just like SQL queries. Now the why we call it as a query is because it's not like a lengthy program. It's just like a one or two the max 5 lines of code. And looking at the code, it's like more self-explanatory, like what that code is being doing. So SQL queries. So the first SQL query which we can discuss is creating a database, as we talked here, right? So how can we create a database using SQL? So in order to create a database, there are like two things. First thing is syntax, like similar to like our Python programming language. Here also we have is a syntax for any database creation. So syntax is basically like create database followed by a database name. So I'm just putting quotes here so that we know like in this quotes, whatever it's written is like user defined. So whatever has been provided inside this quote is user defined. So what can be an example for creating a database? Let's say I want to create a database for all the persons. So I can say create database person. So using these three keywords and executing it, I shall be able to create a database with a name called as person. Now let me see if I can find something online which can help us create a database. Okay, so online it will not help us create a database, but we can create tables. So, but just for now, this is the only syntax which we need for creating a database. Now, after executing this statement, we'll not be able to see any kind of display or any kind of visualizing thing for this command. The only thing which we can see is um, a message indicating like database called as person is created. That's all. And if we try to rerun this command again, then it will give us a message that database called as person is already been created. So we cannot recreate a new database with the same name. So that's like more easy as it is. Since this is like your like first example, uh, you might not be much aware right now, but once we go into more and more examples by executing in live session, then we can get to know. And most of the stuff regarding tables, we'll be doing that inside our programming session, like uh, online IDE session, where we can execute these queries. So moving forward, uh, other than creating a database, there is a command called as drop database, but we'll do that later. If you go by this same sequence, the next is creating a table. Now, how do we create a table in SQL? So syntax for creating table is similar to database, but the change here is create table followed by table name. And since this is a table, if you see here, every table needs column names, right? Like here in this name table, we have two columns called as name and age. And in addition to the name of the column, we need like something called as data types. And these data types are similar to like any programming language. So for name, we have is something called as string, and age, we have something called as integers. But the equivalent name for string in SQL is varchar, which is varchar2 or just varchar. So the syntax here is create table name. On the next line, it will be open bracket, close bracket. Then I can write column one, which is like user defined. And I can say varchar. Same way, I can create column two and I can say it can be integer and so on. So I can create n number of columns with different data types. Now we'll go into each and every data types when we execute the query. Now what I see is this session is almost about to get over. What we can do is we can join on the link which I shared and we'll continue over.
Sir, or shall I create the new one from my side? If it is okay with you, then it's fine from your link.
Anything is fine. Even if you share, then that is also fine.
Okay. All right then. I thought is there any issue with your ID? That's why.
Yeah, like it will be better if you can share. That will help
Okay,
more.
okay.
Yeah.
Immediately I'll send you guys. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.